First of all, my sort of health warning or something, for the morning. I'm deaf as a post, really. But I've also, unfortunately, got a loud voice. So the first thing is, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a start. But remember, when it comes to questions, I may refer back to Gareth so that I get the question right. Okay? Second thing, being back in Edinburgh, with thanks to Mick, particularly to Mick, it's funny being here because in my misspent youth a million years ago, and it really was, I used to teach at a place called ESCS, Edinburgh School of English Studies, in the summer, and it was just over the road. And so coming here, I thought, oh, this is sort of familiar. Anyway, thank you. Look, to business, as it were. Big subject that we're dealing with today, and I had a sort of, an issue in my mind. Am I going to be speaking about Palestine? No, I wanted to sort of do something else. I suppose as a genocide scholar, one of the things one's always trying to look at is patterns and parallels. I mean, every event is different. Every event is in its own way unique, but sometimes you can see patterns and parallels in events, including genocidal events. And while I'm not going to be shoving Palestine down your throats, I think some of the things I'm going to be talking about today in my focus will, I think, have resonances for you. You think, oh, that's a little like that, but it's not the same. It's not the same. Something else I think I want to say right at the beginning is that, that classic statement, to understand is not to pardon. So we're trying to understand an event here, but we're not pardoning it, but I am wanting to understand people. Both sides of the coin, the people who we might think of as perpetrators, but also the people we might think of as victims, but also something challenging when victims can themselves become perpetrators.
Yeah.
That's a more tricky one. And I wanted to do it today by looking at something closer to home, which might actually scratch the skin in some ways, because it involves Scots, and Scots close to home in Ireland. And this is tricky when it comes, in a way, I think all of us actually like genocides far away. Something we can say, oh, it's out there. Those nasty, nasty people out there doing this. Aren't they ugly, abysmal, etc.? And I wanted to bring this a little bit closer to home. Now, I should say, in saying that I am not a scholar of Ireland or Scotland. And some of the things I might be saying about, you might say, well, I know all that already, and I apologise if I'm going over ground which is too familiar to you. Apologies. But I'm trying to look at it through the prism of genocide scholar. Yeah. Okay? So that's my starting point. And I suppose to start with the thing about patterns of genocide. There is in genocide studies something called comparative genocide studies, where people compare this one with that one. And it was interesting that I'm sure all you folk, you're keeping abreast of some of the voluminous amount of stuff which has been written on Palestine now. A colleague of mine called Raz Siegel was very early up in writing about what was happening in Gaza after October the 7th, and he called it a textbook case for genocide. And he went about this by picking a genocide in a colonial environment and making a comparison. And that particular example he picked was the German assault on the Herero in 1904, in which the Herero were more or less exterminated, but it started with a particular set of events. And I was interested by this example because I thought, actually, I can do one better than that. I can do something which has more resonance than the Herero one, which was a particular colonial event. Now, in a sense, in looking at Ireland, is it colonial or is it somebody's backyard? In a way, I don't want to get too much into that, but I am starting off with a specific set of events, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the specific set of events, and then I'm going to try and roll it out and unravel it a bit. And I'm going to be looking at the events themselves, then I'm going to say something about people, the people involved, and what happened to those people. And then I'm going to try and make some observations at the end, a sort of conclusion in which I talk about this and make some commentary of my own, which you can sort of say, agree with that, don't agree with that, etc. Okay. So, October the 7th, Gaza, 2023. My starting point is another October date, but October the 23rd, 1641. So that's getting on for 400 years ago. And 400 years is a long time, long distance. It's what historians would call a diachronic comparison. It's not synchronic, it's not in the now, it's 400 years. What happened on the 23rd of October 1641? There was an explosion of violence which started in the Ulster province of English-controlled Ireland. English, and I should say Scottish-controlled Ireland, coming on to that shortly. There were a series of massacres which continued over a period of days and weeks. And in those massacres, settlers from Britain, from Scotland and Ireland, were killed in thousands. Now, how many thousands is one of those things which people have argued about. The figure became so large in the propaganda which came out about this, the propaganda which came from England and from Scotland, that there were more people killed than there were in Ireland. But nevertheless, the historians say today at least 4,000 people were killed in these massacres, and they were men, women, children, and it is undoubtedly the case that in those massacres the most horrendous things were done, as happens in a massacre. It's interesting what the onset of this was. This was an attempt by the Ulster lords, the Ulster chieftains, the Irish Catholic Ulster chieftains, as them were, to take advantage of a constitutional weakness in England in the early 1640s that may itself have a certain resonance, a constitutional weakness of executive versus legislative in Israel in 2023, if you can think back before October the 7th. In this case, there was something similar, and interestingly, the point of reference of the constitutional weakness was also the English Crown getting very upset with Scottish Covenanters and deciding whether to raise an army against, and having to find the money to raise an army against Scotland. The Irish lords took advantage of this situation. The massacres, the coup which they were trying to do, they were trying to shoot across the bows of the English Crown and say, look, you've got to take interest in us too. We're fed up with what's been going on for the last 100 years in our part of the world, in Ireland. They initiated this coup. The massacres very clearly got out of hand. In English and Scottish minds, this was an absolute rupture from what had been happening up to this time. I will talk about that in a moment, but the important thing to focus on is that this was a rupture in the same way as it was in the Israeli mind on October the 7th. There could never be a going back to what had happened previously. It's something I've called, I won't talk about it now, but it's something I've called the perpetrator's never again syndrome. But we'll never go back to where we were before because we gave them half a chance and look what they did. They massacred us. So one has to know something about the mind of those who ultimately commit genocide in relation to something which they see as the most grotesque and awful thing that can happen to them. Now, it's interesting who responded to this first. And by the way, of course, there was a whole series of propaganda leaflets and pamphlets about the abominations which the Irish had committed against the settlers. Absolute wallowing in it. Who were the first to act at the time against it? It was actually a Scottish army. A Scottish army from Scotland, which took up its position in Carrickfergus, in Ulster, and they committed the first counter-atrocities against the Irish for what had been done to the settlers, many of whom were from Scotland. And then there were a series of counter atrocities. Again. So you can see this is already unravelling. And the unravelling went on for the next 7, 8 years, with a set of wars in Ireland alongside, for those of you who know something of your English and Scottish history, this was the period which is called the War of the Three Kingdoms. There was a set, in England we call it just the English Civil War, but it was actually a set of wars which continued in this period, out of which came the ascendancy of a man called Oliver Cromwell, the killing of the English and Scottish king, Charles I, and with that, a new crisis. So we've had a crisis in 1641 with the massacres of English and Scottish settlers in Ireland, and I haven't said anything yet what they're doing there, why they're English and Scottish settlers. And then in 1649 we have another crisis in which Cromwell, now in ascendancy, responsible for the killing of the king, has a new threat on his hands. If you would like to call it as such, he's having to deal with an axis of resistance. In place of Houthis, Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, the elements which make up the modern day, clearly now much weakened axis of resistance. Then you had royalists and what are called confederates, the Irish chieftains in Ireland, the possibility of the Scottish Covenanters turning against the English and supporting the would-be new king, Charles II. Sorry to throw at you a lot of history here. A very powerful foreign player called the Duke of Lorraine, who has a lot of dosh and might be able to support the Irish and Scottish rebels. And finally, the papacy. And the papacy plays a role in this period a bit like the threat of Islamic jihad. They're everywhere. There are papists and Jesuit priests all over Ireland. And if we allow them to take over, it's the end of civilization as we know it. It's civilizational erasure, right? So this is the situation which Cromwell in 1649, thinking back to the abominations of 1641, has to deal with. How is he going to scotch this potential axis of resistance? He takes an army to Ireland, and if you have Irish background or you know about this, you'll know that Cromwell is the main man. Cromwell is, paradoxically, that great hero Cromwell, for many Englishmen, and he is, of course, in some ways. Here we've got a paradox. Revolutionary radical, who is actually our Netanyahu at the same time. He takes the army to Ireland, the New Model Army. They destroy, they exterminate a number of towns, Wexford, Drogheda en route. Cromwell has more or less destroyed the mainstream armies which are put in his place, the Royalists and the Confederates. But the war goes on as a guerrilla war. And in that guerrilla war, there is no mercy to anything or anybody, anything on the ground. The armies which Cromwell leaves in place in Ireland, they carry through a scorched earth policy. They dig up ditches, they kill cattle, they corral them, they cut down forests to make free fire zones. They consciously practice starvation through scorched earth. We remember the Cromwellian episode at the beginning. We tend to forget what happened in the 3-4 years afterwards. In that period, the fabric of Irish society really unravels. And perhaps it's difficult, nobody was counting. But about 1.5 million Irish people in Ireland, perhaps 200 to 400,000 of them die. Not all at the point of the sword. The women and children mostly die through starvation or through famine, including the plague, because society has come down to that level, if you like, of collapse. That's not all, hence the map, because this is interesting what's going on here. There is a peace process at its end. It's a peace process for Scotland, which Cromwell has himself defeated after 1649 and has subordinated to England. But he's subordinated it. He's not exterminated it. In Ireland, the follow-through is different, very different. There is something called the Act of Settlement. As I say, it affects Scotland, but it's different in Ireland. The Act of Settlement is 1652, and the Act of Settlement begins with the preamble: we do not aim to extirpate the Irish. That's the preamble. The reality, you have to sort of always follow through with what the reality is. The reality is that people who have been associated with the 1641 rebellion are to lose their lives. Their followers, their tenants, or whatever, the soldiers are to be impressed, indentured, effectively as slaves, and sent elsewhere. There's 5 categories, in fact, of people who are should be killed. They include, of course, Jesuit priests and papists. That goes without saying. So there's 5 categories of that. Everybody else who is Catholic and Irish, what is to happen to them? At least in the Act of Settlement. In the Act of Settlement, they are to be moved, transplanted. In place of plantation of settlers, the Catholic Irish are to be transplanted. And the notion is in this sense. The majority of Ireland, Leinster, Munster, Ulster, is to be settled, planted with English and Scottish settlers. The rest are to go to Connaught, beyond the Shannon, the green bit. Shannon, in effect, acts as a dividing line, a green line, if you like. And the term later on is to hell or Connaught. To hell, it's fairly obvious what that means. Or Connaught, this is where you're going to go. So, what actually happened next? So, of course, what am I saying here? Acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing. We don't need to look to the Herreros. We don't need to look to Australia. We don't need to look to the Americas. Here we've got something in our own backyard, and I'd be very interested to know how many of you ever got to learn about this when you went to school. And that's interesting in itself. I should say, I obviously have taught genocide. I used to teach a course called Looking Beyond the Holocaust. I'm a Holocaust historian, of course. You can't be a genocide scholar without looking at the Holocaust. But looking beyond the Holocaust, you have a group of 18, 19-year-old students, and you're considering something like Armenia. Do they know where Armenia is? No. Do they know about the Armenian genocide? No. Do they know really about Rwanda? No. So it becomes my role to use those as case studies to try and inculcate a little bit of the breadth of what we're talking about here. Genocide, in my view, is not frequent as a phenomena, but it's not uncommon. In other words, maybe we can't look at it just as a set of aberrations, but as something which is potentially systemic. It may tell us something about something broader which is going on here. Yeah. To return to the picture, what actually happened as a result of the Act of Settlement? A lot of Irish Catholics ended up, those who had fought in the armies, they either get impressed into foreign armies on the continent, or they become indentured particularly to the West Indies, to the new emerging slave plantations. It's not just people of colour who end up in these places. Whole swathes of Irishmen end up in places like Barbados and Montserrat as indentured slaves. It's not quite the same as being a slave. They might, after years of labour, be allowed to come out of it. The actual land itself, now, something I haven't mentioned. I was mentioning about system here. Why are the English planning this process of removing people who have lived for thousands of years in Ireland to a particular corner of it? In 1641, we go back to that for a moment. In 1641, when it was decreed by an Act of Parliament that the Irish were to be crushed for what they had done, to be crushed, they had to bring through an Act of Parliament to raise an army to go to Ireland, which was on the cards right from the beginning. The fact that it was delayed for 8 years is beside the point. The City of London had to cough up money for this process. A lot of money. £10 million. A lot of money in those terms, in that time. That money had to be repaid by Parliament. How was it going to be repaid? Or who was going to be repaid? Two groups of people needed to be repaid. The soldiers for their service, who for several years in the New Model Army had not been paid. And the notion was, we'll repay them by dispossessing Irish Catholics and giving land to soldiers. But the larger part was the people who had to be paid from the City of London. They were called adventurers. I think the terminology we would use today is venture capitalists. And the venture capitalists were to be repaid, the venture capitalists were to be repaid with huge estates which were to be carved out of Ireland. At the head of this, I should say something more which is interesting about this. At the head of this is a man called Sir Edward Petty. He is Physician General for Cromwell's army in Ireland. He's also, if you look him up, Petty, P-E-T-T-Y, you'll find that you're looking at a man who's a famous astronomer, mathematician, musician. He's a polymath. He's a Renaissance man. And it's something we have to be warned of in terms of looking at genocides. If we look at some of the earlier figures from the earlier invasion and conquest of Ireland, the attempted conquest in the 1580s and 90s, we have people like Sir Walter Raleigh, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spenser, writer of The Faerie Queene, somebody at the same period as Shakespeare. These people are Renaissance men. They're not stupid. They're actually the creme de la creme of English society. But they have very decided views on Ireland. And for people like them, the Irish, what are they? Savages. Cannibals. Are there instances of cannibalism in Ireland when people like Spencer are there? Yes, there are. We know of this. Why? Because people are starving. Why are people starving? An earlier period of scorched earth policy. So, cannibals, abominations. These people are abominations. Question, what are we going to do with them? Are we going to try and encapsulate them and make them part of our society as a sort of lumpen proletariat, as the lowest of the low, because they are scum of the earth? But are we going to encapsulate them somehow? And this had been the English project back to the early Tudor times. How can we bring Ireland into the fold? Or alternatively, by the 1580s, when there had been effectively a series of, if I can use that term, intifadas against the English taking over Ireland, are we just simply going to have to get rid of them? And the Act of Settlement is an attempt by Petty and the Cromwellian regime to find a way of dealing with the Irish. Now, in practice, it doesn't quite work like that. If it had, we wouldn't be looking at Ireland as we know it today. We'd be looking at something very else, something very different. The aristocracy are in effect removed. The social fabric of Ireland is extinguished as it had been. But the soldiers don't want to settle on the land, particularly partly because it's dangerous. And they sell their shares to the landowners, to the venture capitalists, right? The venture capitalists can't find sufficient settlers in the 1650s to populate the island with Scots and English. So they're left with a tenancy, an Irish Catholic tenancy, without their traditional lords and chieftains, who become the substratum of Irish society. I want to throw in something else here, which I think again has resonance. I don't know to what extent you know the term terra nullius. Yeah? Land which is uninhabited or waste, or if there are people in the land, we can't really see them because they're not really people. They're savages. And anyway, there's not a lot of them in the terra. Terra nullius is something the English in Australia particularly referred to the continent of Australia as uninhabited. So it's there for the taking. In a sense, particularly in the north of Ireland, where Irishdom was very strong, where Gaelic was spoken very strongly, there were very strong traditions of Irish separateness. The English look upon the Irish there as, well, there's not a lot of them here anyway, and anyway, they're all nomadic. They're all moving their cattle around from A to B, they're nomadic. Actually, they're not nomadic, they are transhumant. They move their cattle around on a seasonal basis. But for the English who are looking at Ulster and the Scots who are looking at Ulster, this is something which is a sort of terra nullius. It's open to us. And it's interesting that when James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, he's looking for a way to keep his Scottish subjects on board, and he encourages the creation of plantations in Ulster at the expense of Irish Catholics. So when we think of Northern Ireland today and Ulster, this is a project which really begins. Oh, this is exciting. I'm being exterminated. It's the Daleks come into play.
That's what they're at.
Let me find my place again. You see, it's very easy to be thrown. I'm very easy to be thrown. So, I think you can see what we've got here. We've got an event, a series of events which radically change Ireland. They are genocidal events, but there is a developmental project involved in it. It's consciously, after 1649, it's consciously developmental. It's what had been failed to be done in the earlier period of the 1580s, the 1590s, when there are these continual wars with the Irish. After 1649, we're going to make this happen, and it's going to change what Ireland is. And it fails. That's perhaps the good thing. The project fails. But later on, and here we get a further twist, a paradox. Later on, later in the century, there are more Scottish, particularly Scottish settlers who settle in Ulster. They have to be supported sometimes by people who are wonderfully called undertakers. Undertakers are people who build fortifications for them, just in case the Irish Catholic tenants start misbehaving again and they have to run into the fortifications to save themselves from being massacred again. Anyway, there is a paradox though here. The Scottish settlers are people. They're just people. A lot of them are lowland Scots, and they are extremely poor. And they are fleeing famine in Scotland. So here they come. Who comes with them? A whole bunch of Huguenots fleeing religious persecution. A whole bunch of Quakers fleeing persecution. And they become involved. Some of these people become involved in new industries, flax and linen, which are potential driving forces for economic development in Ulster. But the new fabric of settlement, of course, is very Scots Presbyterian. It's part of the new order, if you like. Now, one further thing I want to say here before I come to some observations. Again, further paradox. And it is that point I was saying about victims and perpetrators and that blurred line. A lot of the new Scots-Irish don't stay in Ireland because there is further famine. They're pissed off because the people who are really in charge are all those venture capitalists who have now become what's called the ascendancy, the people who are really in charge. They can't make a living in Ireland, so where do they go? They head off in their thousands elsewhere. First to the colonies in America. Land is already being taken up by other people who have arrived, so where do they go? The frontiers. What do they do on the frontiers? They try and carve out territory for themselves. Many of them are considered a law unto themselves. And many of them are associated, groups like the Paxton Boys, with massacres of Indians on the frontiers. How should we look at these people? Perpetrators, victims? What is their actual position? Are they just ordinary people who are just unfortunate enough? For the authorities, they're just scum of the earth, but useful scum of the earth. They are joined, of course, after the 45, which you will know about if you've had your Scottish history, which is another break point in British history. They are joined in the generations after that by Irish people, Scottish people who are dispossessed as a consequence of the Highland clearances. A lot of the people who are dispossessed end up in regiments organised by the British Crown, who become the ethnic soldiers, the cutting edge of colonial wars in every conceivable place in the emerging British Empire you can think of. And of course, they're joined by lots and lots of Irish at the frontiers. Now I just want to, before I get to the observations, a story here, because it's my ending point really. So we're dealing with people who are themselves dispossessed, who end up dispossessing others. And I was struck a couple of years ago, because my big thing actually is climate change. It's the relationship between genocide and climate change, just for your point of reference. I was struck a couple of years ago when there was some terrible forest fires in Victoria, in Australia, in an area called Gippsland. And I thought, I know Gippsland. That rings a bell. Gippsland. What happened in Gippsland? In Gippsland in the 1840s, there were some most abysmal massacres of Aboriginal peoples. They were led by something called the Highland Brigade. Who were the Highland Brigade? Highland Brigade were made up of dispossessed people from the Highland clearances. They were led actually by one man, a man in particular called Angus Macmillan. Angus Macmillan was originally from Skye. Family moved to Barra, couldn't make a living there, ended up in Australia, where he became the self-styled butcher of Gippsland. Right? Actually, completely lionised for the next 130, 40 years in Victoria as one of the pioneers of the state of Victoria. So, how do we look upon these people? And what is the driving forces here? Now, let me just finish with some observations. October the 23rd, 1641, like October the 7th, it unleashed a challenge to the status quo, to which the response by that status quo wasn't to go back to the status quo ante. It was to do something yet more radical than had been the case before. It was a clean slate in effect. We can do what we like now because you lot, by what you have done, have made it allowable. We can create a new frame of reference. That frame of reference in this case was no longer a notion of we will live with you on our terms. Actually, we will live on our terms by superseding you for a settlement. You're no longer part of the picture. That's the first thing I think I get as a takeaway. This led to the collapse of the Irish Catholic society, which had existed under the aegis of the English, but had nevertheless existed with all its trials, tribulations and sins, but had nevertheless existed up to that point in time. And the English response to the Irish was to create a cordon sanitaire around them, to put them on a reservation. And that, again, will have very many resonances from colonial history. As I said before, the good thing, it was actually unrealised. The Irish were not extirpated, they remained there as the fundamental part of Irish society. If you're thinking Palestinian, that's my take on this. Ultimately, I'm nearly there. It's Palestinian society will carry on. It will survive. Irish society did survive. However, there was a new settled society which was fundamentally, in some ways fundamentally different, in some ways not fundamentally different. I haven't actually explained that yet, and I won't, and we'll come back to that in questions. But they also were on the island of Ireland. The island of Ireland. They were also there. And one should also say, this is a subject of local, national, international histories. This is part of, even though it's not taught in the schools, it's part of English history, Scottish history. It's there locally in the old firm, right? Yeah, it's part of, it's intrinsic to that. It's part of all our histories. Now, here's where I finish, and it may not be where you finish. How do we transcend that? Do we transcend it through binaries? These people, those people, bad, good, however one wants to, the modern and the uncivilized, another way of looking at it. Or do we look at it as has happened after all these centuries of Irish trials and tribulations? What did happen in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement? But there was the possibility of the notion of living alongside and beyond and together with. The notions of living alongside and together with. There is a reality about Ireland. You can't wipe it away and say there is no settlement in Northern Ireland. It exists. It happened through terrible conditions which were part, I would say, of a developmental process. So I'm going to finish with something which I got out of the Gippsland episode. The fact that there is now a re-evaluation of the place of Angus Macmillan in the history of Victoria. And some people, came to his defence afterwards and saying, well, he was a pioneer, he was a hero. The Aborigines deserve what they got. Interestingly, the descendant of his right-hand man, who was a man called Sinclair, one of his descendants called Vicky Sinclair, looked into all this a bit more closely, and she wrote a book about it. And she said at the end of it, and in some ways what she said is banal, but it also has a truth in it. I can't change what happened, but it's what we do next that matters. Thank you.